Hi, everyone. This is Joe Brewer here, and I wanted to record a fly-through of a Google Earth presentation that was created for the Refi Barichara event, and that will enable more of you out there to get a feel for the different projects that exist in Barichara and where they are on the different parts of the landscape. So you can start to see some of the territorial patterns that we have here. And for those of you who have been to Barichara or that attended the Refi Barichara event, this will just be a place where you can come back and refresh yourselves about what we covered when we gave an introduction to the context of this landscape. So with that said, I'd love to share my screen and take you through a brief Google Earth presentation. Okay. So for starters, I want to orient us that we are on this turn in the Andes of South America, where you can see here the Andes come from the southwest to the northeast, and then they make a turn, and you can see this isthmus of Panama and that goes into Central America. And where we are going to be talking about today is a part of the Andes that are right in here and that are organized around a regional climate system. And so let's really begin zooming in on this regional climate system so that you can see what we're talking about. This area depicted with the yellow boundaries is an area that is contained by 3 mountain ranges. So I'll zoom in a little further so you can start to see there's a mountain range on the western side as well. And that those mountains to the west are so tall that they actually cause all of the moisture coming from the west to rise up, make clouds and rain, and produce a cloud forest. And so only from the south of those mountains can the moisture come in to this triangle of mountain ranges. And it is in this place that a regional climate system is pretty well defined on the scale of about 500,000 hectares. And that this climate system corresponds with a unique type of ecosystem called the High Andes Tropical Dry Forest. And that this is a region that has more than 7,000 years of archaeological evidence for human habitation. The human habitation may go back farther, but it goes back at least 7,000 years. So you can already begin to orient yourself that we are looking at a geologic scale for defining the bioregion of this area. And as we start to zoom in to see some of the projects here in the landscape, I want you to see that this is Bioparque Moncora, which is a 6.5 hectare piece of land that is owned by an association called Asociación Aquileo Para. And that is an association that has 40 members of the community who live in Barichara, who have set this land aside for community reforestation and for education. And 2 women that lead this work are Camila and Vicky, who are both in their mid-70s and have been working with this project since 2009 when it was started. And I just wanted you to see where it's located right at the top of town. So this is the village of Barichara, and it is right here, just above the town. The next piece of land that we can see is Las Albercas, which is the land where we're placing the home for the campus of the Barichara Ecoversity. This is 10 hectares of land that we've just completed purchasing a few days ago after a 2-year process of going through negotiations and fundraising and navigating everything to bring this to completion. And the important thing to notice about this land is that it is on 10 hectares, that it is part of a biological corridor, a migration pathway for animals, and it's also a convergence place where water flows across the land. And it's a place that has a river that dried up in the mid-1970s that we would like to bring back to life through watershed restoration and reforestation efforts. Right next to the Barichara Ecoversity is this privately owned land called Guaymaro, which is 8.5 hectares of land owned by a Dutch couple who, for the last 10 years, have been reforesting the land. They've created a camping site. They do work with bioconstruction, with water cycling of gray water and black water systems, as well as reforestation of the native forest, and they're creating a permaculture food forest. So this is a place where outsiders who do woofing and overlanding and other kinds of workaways, people from the outside world, come into Barichara and find a comfortable home in Guaymaro. And notice that it is physically connected and adjacent to the Barichara Ecoversity, which means that the reforestation work we do on these 10 hectares of land in Las Albercas, we can add an additional 8.5 hectares of land from Guaymaro. And if you go to the top of the cliff, you have the bioparque. And I can actually zoom out so you can see that. The bioparque is directly above Las Albercas, above the cliff. Next to Guaymaro is another piece of land called Totumo. Totumo is the name of a native tree in this region. And this is a 9.5 hectare reforestation project owned by another neighbor named Manuela, where we have been developing syntropic agriculture projects, and she has been connecting with the neighbors to build cultural patterns of cooperation for us to restore the river that goes through the Barichara ecoversity and to maintain and protect the ecological corridor going through this part of the territory. Now over here, on the other end of a ridge line that drains water through an aquifer system down to the village of Barichara, is a nature reserve that we call Origen del Agua, or the origin of water. And I just want you to notice that even from satellite imagery, you can see how eroded and degraded this land is. This is a 3.2 hectare piece of land. The buildings at the bottom, which you can see right here, these buildings are a rural public school. So there's a direct connection to collaborate with campesino children through the local schools on this land. Currently, the land is being regenerated through watershed restoration techniques, reforestation techniques, bringing in bird feeders to encourage ecological connectivity for the migration of animals, and also practicing syntropic agriculture techniques as part of our learning center in syntropic agroforestry. And so I just wanted you to see this land that is called Origen del Agua because it sits at the top of a ridgeline where there is an aquifer system, a groundwater supply, that brings water to the village of Barichara. And it's also part of a tributary or a surface water drainage that drains into the larger Barichara River. And so this is another piece of land that you can walk to from the village of Barichara in 1 to 1.5 hours on one of the ancestral Camino Real stone paths that the indigenous people have used for thousands of years. And that this is a connection point ecologically on the land that is connected to the other projects through the movements of water over the surface and subterranean through the aquifer systems of the land. The next piece of land that I want to show you is called Fundación Monte Chico, which is a cultural education learning center that has a nature reserve, a private nature reserve called Reserva Ernesto Jimenez Lozada, which is the name of the husband of Angela Jimenez, who is the owner of the Hotel Alto del Viento. And this reserve is a place where the Monte Chico Foundation offers workshops that protect cultural heritage around things like earthen construction, textiles, basket weaving, natural clothing dyes, and natural fibers for clothing and for paper. And that all of this is built into a food forest system, practicing watershed retention, permaculture, food forest kinds of structures, as well as syntropic agriculture on the land, interweaving it together with these educational activities. And you can notice that it's right next to and very close. It's not physically connected to the bioparque, but it's a short 2-minute walk from one to the other. Now, the next piece of land that I want to show you is called Ojo de Agua, and also a new traditionally constructed mud and earth building that is a community theater called Cane Colibri. And the thing about Ojo de Agua is that this is a foundation, Fundación Ojo de Agua, where they are setting up a learning center using the theater that's being constructed now. But for many years, the owners of this project, Oscar and Emilce, have been working with the area schools and with area children, using insights and techniques from theater, photography, how to conduct interviews, how to create documentaries, to have children gather and reconstruct the history of the territory and cultivate conscience so that they become protectors of the natural world. So this is a place that is a family home and a community project for weaving the educational activities for children to learn about their local environment, as well as the history of violence and peace, and the ways that water went away during times of conflict, the different regeneration efforts that are happening throughout the territory, and so on. All of them organized around this community theater called Cane Colibri. Another project that's very important in the territory is called Agua Santa, which is run primarily by Carlos Gomez, but also with his wife, Maritza Garcia. And this is a 14-hectare regenerative agriculture project where they have also been restoring a watershed, and they're building soils, and they have a productive and financially viable regenerative agriculture project working with coffee as well as fruit trees and nuts, and also a unique way of harvesting the native vanilla plants to make vanilla extract. And what's really important about Agua Santa is that it's both a physical site, it's its own farm, but it's also part of a network of 14 farms doing regenerative agriculture in this area. And Agua Santa acts as the learning center for teaching biochar, how to create terra preta, which is an indigenous style of composting from the Amazon, how to create compost in more modern scientific ways as well, and then how to bring these various techniques together with the regenerative agriculture, cooperating across 14 farms within the area. And this is the major agricultural zone of the territory. So Agua Santa, which translates into English as holy water, is a place for learning the sacred connections to water, regenerative agriculture, cooperative businesses between neighbors, as well as regenerative land practices of various kinds. Another important project is called Huerta Comunitaria, which translates into English as the community garden or the community orchard. During the early days of the COVID pandemic in 2020, this was a place that the owners, this is a private piece of land owned by a couple named Paul and Emarita, and they offered to set aside part of their farm for 16 families, 16 of their neighbors, to engage in food security by creating a community garden. And this is because during the COVID pandemic, when all of the military lockdowns occurred in Colombia to manage the virus, they shut down the local tourism economy, and people very quickly had no money. And so they needed to grow their own food to be able to survive. And the Huerta Comunitaria began simply as a survival response to the pandemic. But very quickly, it became visible that it was a way of weaving relationships between neighbors. And now, 2.5 years later, it's a vibrant community space for neighbors to learn techniques from each other related to food production and food processing, reforestation, agriculture, gardening, and much, much more. And when we started the Learning Center in Syntropic Agriculture, one of the demonstration sites that the communities use all across the territory to learn about syntropic agriculture is located at the Huerta Comunitaria. So this is a very important example of an emergent community process embedded within a natural disaster and a crisis response, tied together with community weaving and community resilience that is being accumulated in the form of regenerative cultural practices together with landscape restoration, and weaving together different elements of the regional food system. Now, very close to the village, or to the Huerta Comunitaria, is the village of Guane. Guane is the name of the ancestral indigenous people of this region. Guane is a village with about 300 people. It's a very small village. And it's a place where the most traditional Guane practices are still preserved. And the closest blood relatives of the Guane people, which were largely the victims of a successful genocide, the remaining people live in this village. And it's a place that has created its own community aqueduct to try to build its own sovereignty around water. And many of the people who go to the Huerta Comunitaria live in the village of Guane or in the countryside nearby. In the middle of Barichara is a really important project called Casa Común. And Casa Común, which just means the common house in English, is actually a community kitchen, as well as a place that receives earth regenerators from around the world. And it's also got rooms that can be made available for community members in crisis, especially for women who are in very precarious situations, like women that are escaping domestic violence, or who are recovering from drug addiction or other challenges that they face. This is a community center that is a protective place for them. And at the same time, there's a community kitchen that has been used to teach practices about how to use native plants, and to preserve the cultural heritage of the region. And in this last year, it has also become a vibrant community center for helping us to build a territorial scale foundation for engaging in bioregional governance. And recently, they created the Casa Común Tienda, a store that is comprised completely of local projects or local products made by people who live in Barichara and the surrounding area. And they are building a solidarity exchange market for a community or a local economy that can live in parallel with the tourism economy. So this is a place that helps people learn how to process waste products from their farms, turn them into high value added food products that can then be sold into the tourism economy. And also there's a community exchange within the tienda of Casa Común for people to exchange directly with each other throughout the territory among the locals who live here. And this is a project that is led primarily by a woman named Margarita, who is a community leader, but really she represents a network of families and communities across the territory, small villages, networks like the Foundation Mujer y Vida, which represents 50 families working on food resilience and trauma healing. And this is a community center that weaves together all of these elements in one place. Now, the next project that I'd like to show you is called Corazoma. Corazoma, which just translates into English as heart, body. Cora for corazon, and soma is the Latin word for body. And it's actually a word used in English in scientific circles. The soma is the body. So Corazoma represents the integration of heart and body. It's a group of women who operate as different kinds of therapists or traditional indigenous medicine healers who work together on the themes of collective trauma and primarily focus on violence and trauma among the women in the community. But obviously, the trauma among the women implies and is deeply woven together with the trauma for the men and for the children, as well as for the non-human species. So Corazoma is a community that's led by a small team of strong women focusing on the healing of cultural traumas. And as a physical location, it's also a permaculture site where they're doing landscape restoration. And a lot of community processes occur on this land related to trauma healing. Another very important location in the territory is called Salto de Mico, which translates into English as the monkey's jump, the place where the monkey jumps off the cliff. This is a place that has a famous mythology in this territory. The mythology says, and it's a mythology primarily because it functions in the mythic sense as an orienting narrative of worldview, and also because the evidence to confirm it is not available. And so the story of Salto de Mico is that the final Guane people, who were famous for their fierce resistance against the conquistadors, the story goes that the Guane people were never conquered because the last group of their warriors and their chief chose to jump off the cliff to their deaths instead of being conquered. That it was a willful act of sovereignty for them to take their own lives. And like I said, this operates as an orienting mythology of an indigenous people who were never conquered, or as what might be said, these are the unceded lands of the Guane people. They never signed a contract or a treaty giving the land to the conquistadors. They just refused to be conquered and were largely wiped out. And Salto de Mico is the waterfall where all of the water from the Barichara River goes over the cliff from the plateau into the valley below. And Salto de Mico is the monkey's jump. It's about a 400-foot waterfall of magnificent beauty. And it's a place that reveals the conscience of the territory because 100% of the black water, or the water dumped from the toilets in the village of Barichara, 100% of it goes unfiltered directly over the waterfall as a giant poop chute, revealing that there's local corruption in the local mayor and the city governance, and that the sacred site is being polluted by feces and urine from the toilets. And most of the tourists who come here have no idea that they're contributing to creating cancer and other problems among the children living below. So Salto de Mico is both a mythic narrative, a symbolic ecological site, and an indicator of cultural consciousness as it relates to regenerative practices. meaning that if we're able to restore the health of Salto de Mico, we will have addressed all of those different elements at once. Now, connected to Salto de Mico is a much larger plateau, which is about 20 miles from one end to the other. And what I want you to notice is that it's almost completely deforested. From these satellite images, you can see a lot of yellow, white, and red, when 50 years ago, almost all of this was still forest. 80 years ago, the deforestation began to start planting monoculture crops of corn and squash, of beans and squash. Corn came later. And then there was a period for 30 or 40 years in the middle of the last century when there was intensive agriculture for tobacco, which further depleted the soils. And after they had fully deforested 95% of the native forest, these steep slopes with a lot of clay soils became major sources of erosion. And now all of the rivers of this area are dead or thoroughly contaminated if they have any water in them at all. And this deforested plateau, which is on the scale of approximately 100,000 hectares, is a part of the focus for the regeneration of the territory. Connected to the deforested plateau is a ridgeline that runs between the village of Barichara and the site of Origen del Agua that I like to call the Hidden Serpent. The locals don't use this name. This is the name that I give it myself. And this is because there is a subterranean aquifer system. For about 300 years, the village of Barichara was completely water-fed and completely independent because all of the water from this ridgeline came to surface wells where in the houses in Barichara, people would just take a bucket and scoop water out of the well, and that's what they used to provide for all of their needs. And in the mid-1990s, a corrupt mayor came and said that the aquifer system was contaminated, which there was actually no data verifying this to be the case. And they put in a private aqueduct system and started selling water to all of the people in the village of Barichara and said that all of these wells in the courtyards of the houses were contaminated. And so one thing that I want to say here is that as you look at all of the other projects like Bioparque Moncora, which has this aquifer system running right through it, if you look below the cliff where we had the Barichara Ecoversity, Guaymaro, and Totumo, and at the top of this aquifer system is the Origen del Agua Nature Reserve, that you can see that landscape features like these aquifers on a ridgeline help to connect the projects on the ground. And the projects on the ground are accumulating connectivity, like putting in the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, to make it possible to restore something like this aquifer system, which is at the scale of the landscape itself. The final feature that I want to show you is the Barichara River, which is these blue lines. And I want to stress that I didn't fill in all of the tributaries. I only drew the main channel and then put in 3 of the tributaries that you can see up here above, one of them coming from Origen del Agua and down. When I counted from Google Maps and Google Earth, I counted 15 of these tributaries. There might be more. That's the number that I counted myself. But what I want you to see is that this entire drainage is from a very large area, covering about 25 to 30,000 hectares of land. And it drains out to Salto de Mico down here, which means restoring the Salto de Mico location involves regenerating the entire river system. Right now, there's a group here working on creating a curriculum to have children lead the effort to restore the entire watershed of the Barichara River as a way of creating pedagogical clarity and coherence among all educational activities in the territory. And this is one of the lessons from Barichara, is that we want to use landscape features to be able to connect the different projects. And now that you've gone through this little fly-through of Google Earth, you can see that all of the projects are connected through the landscapes, even though they're spread out in fairly broad distances across the landscape itself. Now, what I wanted to do by sharing this with you is to just give you a little bit of spatial orientation and a little bit more depth of knowledge about several of the projects that exist here and how they're connected with each other. I hope you found this interesting and enlightening, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comment thread below.